Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring what has to be the ultimate underdog story of a tiny, totally resource poor island that pulled off an absolute economic miracle. We are looking at the impossible comeback of Singapore. This is a nation that truly went from zero to a global financial powerhouse through sheer force of will and honestly some incredibly unconventional strategies. At the time, the rest of the world looked at this tiny patch of land and thought survival was a mathematical impossibility. But what they did holds some really incredible lessons for modern leaders, businesses, and honestly anyone facing insurmountable odds. Picture this. It's August 1965, and the mood of the entire nation was basically captured by a single, terrifying thought. We're gonna die, we're definitely gonna die. And that wasn't some political hyperbole. When Singapore was abruptly expelled from the Federation of Malaysia, its leader, Lee Kuan Yew, went on television and literally cried actual tears. He thought his newly orphaned nation was completely doomed. I mean, they had no natural resources, they were geographically smaller than New York City, unemployment was through the roof, and they were surrounded by neighbors who were, frankly, openly hostile. Keep that absolute, tear-inducing desperation in your mind for a second. Now, fast forward just 50 years, one single generation. In that incredibly short span of time, Singapore went from an island with literally zero resources to becoming one of the richest countries on Earth. To put that massive leap into perspective, the average person living there today is structurally wealthier than the average American. It's an economic pivot that just defies almost all conventional logic. Okay, part one. The roots of the mess. Before we can really appreciate how they pulled off this insane comeback, we need to quickly flash back to understand how they ended up in such a desperate situation in the first place. So to understand their origins, we have to look all the way back to 1819. A British man named Stamford Raffles recognized Singapore's perfect location right between India and China, and he set up a trading port. It essentially became this highly lucrative toll booth for the British Empire. Fast forward to 1942, and the brutal Japanese occupation during World War I completely shattered the myth of British military invincibility. Naturally, after the war, the locals wanted independence. So in 1963, the British merged them with Malaya to form Malaysia, hoping the combined territory would bring some stability. But thanks to intense racial and political tensions, the merger failed catastrophically, which led to Singapore's complete expulsion in 1965. So, part two. The blueprint for survival. How did they actually survive being cast out? Let's look at Lee Kuan Yew's rapid-fire solutions to these existential threats. The crucial thing you have to understand here is that they couldn't just casually tackle one problem at a time. They had to fix everything at once. They had absolutely no reliable fresh water supply, a collapsing economy that was totally dependent on retreating British military bases. People were living in these overcrowded, fire-prone slums. A massive chunk of the population couldn't read, and to top it all off, absolutely zero military defense. It was just a compounding cascade of disasters, starting with the very real threat of simply dying of thirst. Take the water issue, for example. First, they literally turned every single building roof on the island into a water catchment area. But obviously that wasn't nearly enough to sustain a whole nation. So when experts told the government that turning seawater into drinking water was impossible with the technology they had at the time, they completely rejected that premise. They simply forced the technology into existence through sheer will and massive investment. It really shows their mindset for survival. Everything is impossible until someone actually does it. Then there was the economy. With absolutely zero natural resources to fall back on, they basically did the exact opposite of what the rest of the world was doing. Back in the 1960s, most developing nations were trying to be totally self-sufficient, putting up massive trade barriers, telling foreign companies to stay away. But Singapore executed a hard pivot. They decided they were going to be the most business-friendly place on Earth. Zero corruption, low taxes, and incredibly efficient government. They deliberately positioned themselves to be this indispensable economic bridge between East and West. Next up, housing. To get rid of those dangerous, unsanitary slums, they rolled out the Central Provident Fund, or the CPF. Basically, this was a mandatory forced savings system. Every single worker had to save a portion of their salary, which could then be used to purchase a government-built apartment. Imagine being forced by law to save your money, but knowing it practically guaranteed you a tangible piece of your own country. It was an absolutely brilliant way to give citizens a literal financial stake in the nation's success. And the results of the CPF policy? Just staggering. By the 1980s, an unbelievable 80% of all Singaporeans lived in public housing that they actually owned. You literally cannot find that level of home ownership in government-built housing anywhere else in the world. It completely transformed the physical and social landscape of the country, turning all these transient populations into deeply invested stakeholders. Now, since people were literally their only resource, education was the next immediate hurdle. They mandated this massive educational overhaul and made English the primary language of instruction. Now, this was pretty controversial at first, but it acted as this totally neutral unifier for the diverse Chinese, Malay, and Indian populations. And crucially, it prepared their kids to dominate in global business. But at the exact same time, they mandated learning a mother tongue to ensure that local culture and heritage were fiercely preserved. But look, none of this growing wealth means anything if you can't protect it, right? Because they started without an army, they introduced what brilliantly and somewhat terrifyingly became known as the poisonous shrimp defense strategy. They implemented mandatory 2-year military service for all able-bodied men. The philosophy was super simple but highly effective. We might be a tiny country, but if you try to swallow us, we will be absolutely toxic. It made the small island way too costly and painful for any larger neighbors to even think about invading. Moving into Section 3, the Asian Values Model. Let's look objectively at the underlying and heavily debated philosophy that actually made all this rapid development possible. Lee Kuan Yew operated on a very specific set of political principles. While Western democracy traditionally prioritizes individual freedom, personal liberty, and free speech, Lee Kuan Yew took a decidedly different path. The Asian values model fundamentally prioritizes social harmony, strict societal order, and the collective good of the entire nation over the desires of the individual. It is a really fascinating paradigm shift when you look at nation building through this lens. But to maintain that overarching order, this philosophy required incredibly strict, authoritarian laws. We're talking about banning the sale of chewing gum entirely just to keep the public infrastructure clean. They handed out heavy fines for minor littering and even used physical caning as a severe punishment for vandalism. On top of that, the government kept a very tight grip on the media and actively limited political opposition just to ensure they could execute their policies without any legislative gridlock. So it was this massive societal trade-off right at the heart of Singapore's success story. Citizens sacrificed certain personal liberties, accepting limited free speech, strict social controls, authoritarian laws. But in exchange, they got wildly clean streets, exceptionally low crime rates, high literacy, and a booming, unprecedented level of prosperity. It was a very calculated, sweeping bargain that put economic survival above absolutely everything else. All right, our final section, from zero to powerhouse. What is the actual tangible legacy of this intense, highly managed blueprint today? Well, by the 1990s, this tiny island had skyrocketed from a desperate third world struggle to a legitimate first world powerhouse. Economists were calling them a fearsome Asian tiger. Their GDP per capita just surged, ultimately surpassing the United States, and stunningly, even surpassing Britain. Think about that. They completely leapfrogged the very empire that had once colonized them and left them behind. They didn't just survive, they mathematically dominated. But, the story doesn't end with some perfect utopia. Even as this economic giant, modern Singapore faces massive new challenges as its founding generation passes on. They're dealing with a rapidly aging population and really low birth rates. Their housing market has become extremely expensive, even with the foundations of the CPF. And maybe most interestingly, they face the huge challenge of maintaining those strict social controls in the era of globalized social media. When every citizen has a smartphone, keeping a tightly controlled narrative becomes infinitely more difficult. So I'm going to leave you with this to think about. As our world continues to rapidly change and globalize, can this unique, super strict Asian values model truly adapt and survive? Or was Singapore's spectacular rapid rise just a one-time miracle? Take a moment to think about what modern leaders, and honestly the rest of us, can genuinely learn from this entirely impossible comeback.